Alright, welcome the fuck back, YouTube. Today, we're going to be reading The Ranger's Apprentice, Book 10. We are currently on Chapter 21. We're leading off from yesterday. If you do not remember what happened yesterday, go ahead and click below. We were on Chapter 17. We are now on Chapter 21, so there's a lot that happened. But yeah, let's get started. Like and subscribe. Chapter 21. The northern coast of Nihonja lay before them as the ship rocked gently on a long, glassy swell. The flatland at the coast quickly gave way to a succession of heavily timbered hills. Behind them, ranges of steep mountains rose high into the air, their peaks already covered in snow and intermittently concealed by cloud driven on the wind. It was a rough-looking country, Will thought as he leaned on the bulwark beside Halt, studying this new land. After weeks at sea, breathing the freshness of the salt air, he was conscious of a new smell borne to him on the wind, charcoal or wood smoke, he realized. They must be relatively close to a town or large village, although at the moment none was visible. There, said Halt, reading his thoughts and pointing to a long cape that thrust out into the sea to the north of them. Will peered at it, but could see no sign of buildings or people. Then he realized what Halt had been pointing at as he made out signs of smoke haze in the air. Judging by the extent of the smoke, he thought, there must be a sizable town beyond the cape. Is that Iwanai? He asked Gundar. The Skrull went through his usual routine of air sniffing, sail checking, and spitting over the side. We've come a little south, he said. He sounded disgruntled, and Will smiled to himself. He'd seen enough of Scandian Skrulls to know that they prided themselves on making perfect landfalls, even in places they'd never actually been before. After weeks at sea, using only the stars, instinct, his North Secret needle, and a cross staff, Gundar had brought them to within a few kilometers of their destination. You've done well, Gundar, Halt said quietly. The Skrull looked at him and shrugged. Could have been better. He checked the wind telltale and leaned on the tiller to bring the bow around to the northwest, setting a course to weather the long cape before them. Wolf Will heeled to port, then began to swoop over the swell. What do we do when we reach Iwanai? Will asked Halt. For so long now, the seaside town in the north of Nihonja had been their goal. Now that they were nearly there, it was time to consider their next course of action. According to the message George sent, the man who guided him down from the mountains will be in the town, Halt said. We need to make contact with him. He's loyal to the Emperor and should be able to take us to him. As easy as that? Will said. We just stroll ashore in a strange town in a foreign country and ask, has anyone seen George's friend, please? Evelyn was consulting the message she had received from George so many weeks ago. His name is Atsu, she told them, and they should be able to put us in touch with him at a ryokan called Shokaku. What's a ryokan? And what's a Shikaku? Will asked, and she smiled helplessly. I haven't the faintest idea, she said. She glanced at Alice for help. The blonde girl had taken a copy of the message when they left Toscana and had been studying it for the past few days, referring to the book of Nihonja words and phrases that Lady Pauline sent to her. A ryokan is an inn, she told them, and a shokaku is a crane of some kind. For lifty things? Will asked. For flying. A crane is a large bird, she corrected him. In fact, near as I can work it out, shokaku means a flying crane. Seems like a logical thing for a crane to do, Halt mused. I suppose you wouldn't expect it to mean a hiking crane or a waddling crane. He paused, then studied Alice carefully for a few seconds. Are you sure you'll be able to make yourself understood here? Alice hesitated. Pretty sure. It's one thing practicing a language with another foreigner, another to hear it spoken by the natives. But I'm fairly sure I'll manage. One thing, though, she added. I think when we go ashore looking for this Atsu person, we should keep the numbers down. The trace of a smile touched Halt's mouth. You're right, he said. After all, we are an exotic bunch, aren't we? I suspect the sight of Selethan, Gundar, and Niles walking the streets would draw a lot of attention. We'd better to keep as a low profile as possible. So it'll just be the four of us? Evelyn said, and Halt shook his head. 3. Alice because she speaks the language. Will because I want someone to watch my back. But, Evelyn began, her cheeks reddening. His unspoken words were all too obvious. There was no useful role she could play in the search for George's former guide. Yet she hated the idea of being left out. Evelyn had a keen sense of curiosity and always liked to be at the center of things. Paul raised an eyebrow at her now. But, he repeated. Well, it's not really fair, is it? Evelyn protested. After all, this is my expedition. The words sounded weak as she said them. Fair has nothing to do with it, Holt replied. But you're right, it is your expedition. Before he could continue, Evelyn seized on his words, thinking he might be showing signs of relenting. That's right. If it weren't for me, none of us would be here. Actually, I think credit for getting us here goes to Gundar, Will interposed, and she glared at him. Holt stepped in quickly to nip any further discord in the bud. As I say, it is your expedition, and I'm sure you'd want to see it carried out in the most efficient way possible, correct? Well, if you put it that way, of course, Evelyn was forced to concede. And that means a small party is going ashore initially, Holt said, his tone indicating that this was the end of the discussion. Then his voice softened a little. Bear with me on this, Evelyn. I know you're anxious about Horace. Will was a little puzzled by Holt's words. No more anxious than the rest of us, surely, he said. Holt turned away and raised his eyebrows as his gaze met Selifen's. Holt turned away and his eyebrows as Holt turned away and raised his eyebrows as his gaze met Selifen's. Sometimes, he thought, his former apprentice could be remarkably slow on the uptake. He saw the Aridi's slow nod of understanding. I think we all agree, Holt, Selifen said. We should keep a low profile until we know the situation here, and you Rangers are very good at that. He smiled at Evelyn. I'm sure the rest of us will have the chance to play a role in due course, Princess. Evelyn gave in. She was disappointed, but she could see that Holt's decision made sense. A large party of foreigners arriving and asking questions would draw attention, and that could lead to locals being reluctant to give out any information at all. If there had in fact been a rebellion against the Emperor, the situation could be extremely touchy in Iwanai. You're right, Holt, she said, and he nodded acknowledgement of her backing down. Nice to hear someone else saying that for a change, Will said cheerfully. Seems I've said those words an awful lot in my time. Holt turned a bleak gaze on him. And you've always been correct. Will shrugged and grinned at Evelyn. She was reconciled to the plan now, and she smiled back at him. The most important thing, she realized, was to find out where Horace had gone. It didn't really matter who found that out, as long as they did. I need a sip of water. Sorry, my back itched. Little intermission. Chapter 22. Shukin found a suitable spot for his plan midway through the following morning. They had descended a deep valley between two massive ridges, and a fast-running river ran throughout the lowest point. The trail they were following led to a shallow ford, wide enough for only 2 men to cross at a time. On the upstream side of the ford, the river tumbled down a steep, rocky cliff. Downstream was a deep, wide pool. On either side, the banks were sheer and steep. Shukin paused as he surveyed the site, waiting for the last of the Kikiri to cross. They waded through the water with difficulty. The shallow water of the ford made the river run even more quickly. A few men could hold this for hours, he said. Arisaka's men can come at us only 2 at a time. Horace surveyed the spot quickly. Those high banks upstream and downstream will stop them coming ashore here. You're right. This is the only point where they can cross. The only danger is if there's another ford somewhere downstream, where they could get across and flank your position. Even if there is, the trees are too thick for them to move downstream quickly. No, this is where they'll have to cross. Shigeru was nodding. Besides, it's not in Arisaka's nature to look for an alternative crossing, he said. He'll want to try to bowl his way across the river here. He's not renowned for subtlety, and he has little regard for the lives of his men. That's what I was thinking, Shukin said. We could reinforce this side with stakes driven into the sand on either side of the ford, Horace said. That'd make sure they'd have to cross on a narrow front. Good idea, Shukin said. He glanced around, saw Aiko watching them, and passed on instructions for some of the Kikiri to cut and sharpen stakes from the trees and hammer them into the ground, set an angle and jutting out over the river's surface. Immediately, a dozen men set about the task. Helps to have a skilled timber worker with you, Horace said with a small grin. So, cousin, Shiguru said, choosing his words carefully. Your plan is to leave a small party of men here to hold the fort and delay Arisaka's army as long as possible? But Shukin was shaking his head before Shiguru finished speaking, as the Emperor had suspected he would be. I'm not leaving a party of men here, he said. I'm staying with them. I can't ask them to do this unless I'm willing to share the danger with them. Shukin, I need you with me, Shiguru said quietly. But Shukin's face had a determined set to it, and Horace could see that his mind was made up. My task is to make sure you're safe, he said. The best way I can do that is to delay Arisaka's men and give you a chance to reach the fortress at Rankoshi. You'll be safe there once the snow comes. And in